Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Roman army stood as the most disciplined and feared fighting force on Earth. But how did ordinary men transform into warriors capable of conquering half the known world? Behind their victories lay a strict, grueling system of training, secrets so intense many would not survive them. This was not just exercise, it was survival. Today we uncover the lost training secrets of Roman soldiers, the very methods that forged an empire. The journey into the Roman legions began long before a recruit ever touched a weapon. It started with an oath, a solemn vow that would bind a man to Rome for the rest of his service. This was not a simple promise. It was a declaration that he was no longer his own master. His life, his body, and his strength belonged entirely to the empire. For many, the decision to enlist was not made lightly. Some were driven by poverty, seeking steady food and pay. Others were born with little choice, raised in provinces where loyalty to Rome was demanded. But once they stood before their officers and swore the sacramentum, there was no turning back. The oath was sacred, and breaking it was treason, punishable by death. Recruitment itself was a careful process. Rome did not accept just anyone into its ranks. A recruit had to be physically fit, strong of body, and capable of enduring pain and hardship. Examiners would test the young men, measuring their height, inspecting their teeth, their posture, even their chest, to judge endurance. Rome wanted soldiers who could march for hours, dig through soil and rock, and still have the strength left to fight. A weak or unhealthy body was a liability, and Rome had no room for weakness in its legions. But physical fitness was only the beginning. A recruit also had to prove his discipline. The Roman military machine depended on absolute obedience. Orders had to be carried out without hesitation, for even the smallest delay in battle could mean disaster for an entire legion. Those who showed arrogance, hesitation, or disobedience were swiftly dismissed. In Rome's eyes, better to turn away 10 men than to accept one who might break under pressure. For many recruits, the first days were filled with humiliation. They were stripped of their civilian clothes and given simple tunics, a reminder that they were no longer individuals but part of a greater whole. They were expected to obey commands instantly, often drilled harshly just to test their will. The Roman officers understood that the civilian spirit had to be broken before the soldier could be built. It was a painful transformation, but it was essential. Some men failed in these early stages. Those who could not endure the tests, who fell behind on the marches, or who disobeyed in training, were publicly shamed. Rome did not hide its rejection. Failure was displayed for all to see, a warning to others that only the strongest and most disciplined would remain. Yet for those who endured, passing this stage was a badge of honor. They had proven themselves worthy of the first step into the most feared army in history. From that moment on, the recruit ceased to be an individual. He was a soldier of Rome, bound by oath, shaped by discipline, and prepared to be forged into something greater than himself. His old life was gone. The life of a legionary had begun. Marching was the true backbone of the Roman army, the very skill that allowed legions to move faster and strike harder than any enemy they faced. From the first days of training, recruits were taught that their feet would carry them further than any sword ever could. Before learning to fight, they had to learn to march, mile after mile, day after day, with the weight of their entire lives strapped to their backs. The Roman standard demanded that a soldier march 20 miles in just 5 hours, carrying a pack that weighed no less than 40 kilograms. Inside that pack was everything he needed to survive: food rations, cooking gear, tools, stakes for building camp, a spare pair of sandals, and his weapons. To a new recruit, the weight was crushing. Many stumbled, collapsed, or even vomited from exhaustion. But there was no sympathy. The centurions pushed them harder, knowing that the man who faltered in training would collapse in war. And in war, failure meant death not just for him, but for his brothers. The marches were timed and coordinated, often set to the sharp blasts of Roman horns or the steady beat of drums. The pace was relentless, forcing men to keep step, heel to toe, shoulder to shoulder. This was not just physical conditioning. It was discipline made real. Each man had to trust the rhythm of the unit, for if one stumbled, the line broke. Over time, what began as agony became second nature. Their bodies hardened, their minds adjusted, and their feet carried them forward almost without thought. But the marches were not aimless journeys. Rome used every step to build not just strength, but infrastructure. Along the way, soldiers were ordered to clear paths, cut down trees, and level ground. They carried picks and shovels as often as swords. laying the foundation for the great Roman roads that still survive today. These roads were not built by engineers alone, but by the sweat and labor of soldiers who turned every march into progress. Wherever the legions went, civilization followed. The grueling pace also prepared them for Rome's greatest advantage: speed. Entire legions could appear where the enemy least expected, covering distances that would have broken lesser armies. Surprise became a weapon as sharp as any blade, for enemies could not believe the Romans could move so far, so fast, with so much weight. This constant readiness to march allowed Rome to crush uprisings before they spread, reinforce distant borders, and strike at enemies who thought themselves safe behind mountains or rivers. For the recruits, mastering the march was a turning point. Once they could carry their burdens across endless miles without faltering, they understood that they were no longer ordinary men. They were part of a force that could reach anywhere, endure anything, and bring Rome's power to every corner of the known world. Long before swords clashed, it was the march that forged Rome's victories. Weapons training was the heart of a Roman soldier's life, and it was far more brutal than most could imagine. To the legions, battle was not a place to experiment or improvise. It was a stage where only discipline and preparation decided who lived and who died. Recruits were introduced to their weapons not as tools of glory, but as instruments of relentless practice. And from the very first lesson, Rome made sure that the training was harder than the war itself. Instead of placing real swords in the hands of new soldiers, instructors gave them wooden blades called rudis. But these practice swords were not lighter to ease the recruit into combat. They were deliberately made twice as heavy as the steel gladius used in battle. The same was true for the shields. Training shields were thicker and heavier than the curved scutum carried on campaign. Every thrust, every block, every strike demanded more strength, more endurance, and more control. The idea was simple. If a man could handle the punishing weight of practice weapons for hours each day, then in real combat the lighter versions would feel effortless. Training was constant repetition. A recruit stood before a wooden post known as a palace and struck at it again and again. Thrust, block, slash, recover, over and over until the movements became second nature. Officers drilled the importance of the thrust above all else. A slash could wound, but a thrust with the gladius could pierce armor, shields, and flesh, ending a fight in seconds. Precision mattered. Strength alone meant nothing without accuracy. Soldiers were taught to strike at the chest, the belly, or the face, always targeting the enemy's most vulnerable points. But practice went far beyond wooden posts. Recruits sparred with one another under the watchful eyes of centurions, who barked corrections and punished mistakes with swift blows from canes. Shields were smashed together, swords rang against wood, and men learned to fight in close quarters where there was no space to swing wildly. They learned to conserve energy, to remain calm under pressure, and to trust the man standing beside them. Weapons training was also about endurance. Hours were spent in the sun, sweat pouring, muscles burning, while the centurions demanded more. Fatigue was not an excuse, for real battles could stretch on for hours. A soldier who dropped his guard when tired was already a dead man, and so, the training fields echoed with the sound of wood striking wood, of men gasping for breath, and of officers shouting until every motion was carved deep into muscle and memory. By the end of this stage, the recruits understood the truth. Rome did not win its wars through sheer numbers or brute force. It won through discipline, precision, and endless training. When the time finally came to exchange the heavy wooden sword for the steel gladius, the soldier felt as if his arm had been freed of chains. What once seemed impossible now felt natural, and in that moment he realized he was ready, not just to fight but to kill, for Rome. Endurance was the hidden strength of the Roman soldier, the quiet power that allowed the legions to outlast enemies who were just as brave, just as fierce, but never as tireless. From the moment a recruit entered training, he was pushed to find the breaking point of his body, and then forced to go beyond it. Rome understood that battles were not won in the first clash of swords, but in the long grind that followed, when hunger, thirst, and exhaustion claimed weaker men. Daily life in camp was itself a trial of endurance. Soldiers rose at dawn, trained under the punishing sun, and were given tasks that tested every muscle in their bodies. They marched with full gear, sometimes for days without rest. They dug trenches deep into rocky soil, built defensive walls from wood and stone, and carried timber for miles. None of this was optional. Even when there was no war, The men were kept in constant motion. An idle soldier grew weak, but a soldier always worked, remained strong. Running was a regular part of training, but it was no ordinary run. Soldiers carried their full packs as they sprinted across uneven ground, through forests, across rivers. Swimming, too, was essential, for rivers and lakes could not slow an army that had to move as one. Soldiers learned to ford waters while holding their shields above their heads, never allowing their weapons to grow useless from soaking. Climbing exercises built agility, forcing men to scale walls, cliffs, and obstacles, often under the weight of their equipment. Rome also trained its soldiers to fight when exhaustion was at its worst. After long marches or heavy labor, men were sent straight into drills or sparring sessions. The body begged for rest, but the centurions demanded more. The lesson was cruel but effective. In war, enemies did not wait until you were ready. A soldier had to strike even when his muscles screamed in pain, even when his lungs burned from lack of air. This ability to fight on when others collapsed became Rome's greatest weapon. Even food and sleep were used to test endurance. Rations could be cut, sleep shortened, to harden men against hunger and fatigue. Soldiers learned to survive on little and keep moving. When compared to their enemies who relied on plentiful supplies or shorter campaigns, the Romans seemed unbreakable. Their bodies adapted to hardship until discomfort no longer slowed them. Through this relentless conditioning, recruits were transformed into machines of endurance. They were not the strongest warriors in the world, nor always the fastest, but they could keep going when others had already surrendered to exhaustion. This was the Roman secret. Their armies could march further, fight longer, and survive conditions that broke entire tribes and kingdoms. By the end of their training, the men knew one thing for certain. Victory did not belong to the soldier who struck first, but to the soldier who stood last. And Rome always stood last. Discipline was the iron core of the Roman legions, the one quality that separated them from every other army of the ancient world. Strength could be found among the Gauls, courage among the Germans, and fierce loyalty among the Carthaginians, but none could match the Romans in obedience. From the first day of training, a recruit learned that the will of Rome mattered more than his own life. Orders were absolute, and the price of disobedience was often paid in blood. Punishments in the Roman army were deliberately harsh. A soldier who fell asleep on guard duty could be beaten to death by his comrades. A man who abandoned his position in battle could face execution, not by enemy hands, but by his own unit. This created a culture of fear, but also of responsibility. Each soldier knew that his mistakes could bring ruin not only on himself, but on the men beside him. In this way, discipline bound the legions together as tightly as their shields in the testudo formation. One of the most terrifying punishments was decimation, reserved for units that showed cowardice or disobedience. The order was carried out without mercy. The guilty cohort was divided into groups of 10, and lots were drawn. Each group then executed the man chosen, often by clubbing or stoning. To the outside world, it was a horror. To Rome, it was a lesson. The legion would rather kill its own than allow weakness to spread. For the survivors, the fear of ever facing such judgment again ensured loyalty beyond question. But punishment was not the only side of discipline. Rewards too played their part. Soldiers who showed bravery in battle could earn honors, decorations, and the respect of their peers. Some were granted extra pay or shares of plunder. In rare cases, a soldier might even earn Roman citizenship for himself and his family. Thus, Rome ruled not only with fear but also with hope, punishing weakness while lifting up the strong. Discipline extended to every part of life, not just the battlefield. Camps had to be built quickly and precisely. Tents were pitched in neat rows, ditches dug to exact measurements, and watch rotations carried out without fail. Everything was done according to a system, and anyone who broke that order risked the wrath of their centurion. Even small mistakes were corrected with punishments, because Rome believed that if a man could not be trusted to dig a trench correctly, he could not be trusted to hold the line in war. For recruits, the system was brutal, but over time it forged unity. Each man learned that his survival depended on the discipline of the unit. Individual courage meant nothing if the line broke, but disciplined obedience meant victory even against stronger foes. By instilling absolute control, Rome created an army that moved as one, fought as one, and endured as one. In the end, discipline was not just a rule of the legions, it was their soul. It was the invisible chain that bound every soldier together, ensuring that no matter the odds, the Roman line would never falter. Mental strength was as vital to a Roman soldier as his sword or shield. Rome understood that wars were not won only by muscle or steel, they were won by the mind. A soldier who feared death, who doubted his comrades, or who lost faith in his commanders was already defeated before the enemy struck. That is why the training grounds were not only about building bodies, but about shaping minds into weapons as sharp as any gladius. From the first days, recruits were taught to think not as individuals but as part of a single machine. The legion was everything, and each man was only one piece of it. Formations like the testudo drilled this lesson into them. Shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, the men moved as one body, protecting one another from arrows and spears. No man could stand apart. His survival depended on his brothers, and theirs depended on him. This trust created an unshakable bond, stronger than family ties. Morale was nurtured through rituals and traditions. Soldiers marched together to chants and songs, their voices echoing across valleys and fields, reminding them that they were never alone. Victories were celebrated with ceremonies and feasts where honors were awarded in front of the entire legion. Even in defeat, commanders knew how to rally their men, promising vengeance and glory if they stood firm. These shared experiences built pride, the belief that a Roman soldier was not just any man, but part of the greatest army the world had ever seen. Training also taught men to control fear. Sparring under the watchful eyes of centurions, recruits were shouted at, beaten and punished until they learned to remain calm under stress. Loud noises, sudden charges, even staged ambushes were used to simulate the chaos of battle. The goal was not to eliminate fear, it was to master it. A Roman soldier learned to breathe, to focus, and to trust his training when panic threatened to overwhelm him. The presence of strong leaders added to this mental resilience. Centurions, hardened by years of war, led from the front. Their scars and discipline were proof that survival was possible if orders were followed. Soldiers looked to them in battle, drawing courage from their example. This confidence in leadership ensured that even when outnumbered, the men did not waver. Faith in Rome itself also fueled the spirit of the legions. Every soldier knew he was not fighting only for his own life but for the empire, for its gods, for its people. The sense of serving something greater gave meaning to their suffering. A man who believed he carried the weight of Rome on his shoulders could endure what others could not. By combining unity, ritual, discipline, and belief, Rome created soldiers who were not only strong in body, but unbreakable in spirit. Enemies might match their strength, but few could match their resolve. It was this mental armor, forged alongside the steel of their weapons, that made the legions unstoppable. When the mind refused to break, the body could march, fight, and endure without end. This was the true secret of Rome's victories. The story of the Roman soldiers' training is not just about drills, weapons, or endless marches. It is about transformation. Ordinary men were taken from farms, villages, and cities, and reshaped into the backbone of the most formidable army the world had ever seen. Through brutal physical tests, relentless endurance training, and the constant grind of discipline, they became more than warriors. They became instruments of Rome's will. Their bodies were hardened to carry impossible burdens, their hands trained to strike with deadly precision, and their minds forged to stand unshaken in the face of fear. Every step of their preparation served one purpose: to ensure that on the battlefield no weakness would remain. Rome's enemies often fought with passion, sometimes with courage greater than their own. But what they lacked was the unbreakable unity and discipline of the legions. The Romans could march further, fight longer, and endure hardships that would shatter others. Their strength was not born in a single moment of glory, but in the long, unseen hours of training fields, the sting of punishment, the weight of wooden swords, and the endless marches beneath the sun. In the end, these lost secrets remind us why the legions were feared across the ancient world. They were not invincible because of luck or numbers, but because Rome had mastered the art of shaping men into soldiers who could not easily be broken. Victory was not an accident. It was built, drilled, and beaten into every soldier who wore the armor of Rome. This was the true power of the empire, not just the walls, the roads, or the wealth, but the men who stood together, bound by oath and forged by fire, carrying the destiny of Rome on their shoulders. And it was here in their training, long before the clash of swords, that the empire's greatness was truly born.